Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Clean Energy Package and Wind Curtailment. We're grateful to our presenter, Dr. David Newberry, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We're the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please use Zoom's Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window to ask your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. David Newberry, Director of the Cambridge Energy Policy Research Group and Emeritus Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Newberry is also a past president of the IAEE and European Economic Association. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. And let's get launched. And thank you for that kind introduction, but particularly for giving me an opportunity to launch on an unsuspected audience a new idea that I've had. Now that we can't meet over coffee and we can only do it virtually, this is the first outing for this, and I'll be very anxious to hear comments and questions. And of course, it's a particular pleasure that it isn't just a local audience. This will be round the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. So my bold claim that I want to test out on you is that there is a new kind, I think it's a new kind of market failure that arises with variable renewable electricity. And it's what I've called a tragedy of the commons, and I'll explain what that means. But it's a problem that arises when you have liberalized and competitive markets and you allow free entry of renewable energy, and that's presumably the world to which we're moving. And it suggests that while this may be a theoretically interesting concept, it only really has traction once it's quantified. So I'm going to build a model. The model is, I think, reasonably simple in outline, but the details are quite complex. And there is a research paper on our Energy Policy Research Group website that can give you all of the gory details. So let me set out what I'm going to do. I've contrasted club goods, which we're familiar with, and the clean energy package is a very good example because the EU member states agree that they are going to meet various objectives, and particularly to deliver public goods like reducing climate damages and also subsidizing technologies that produce learning spillovers. And as part of that, they have to produce national energy and climate plans. Those are useful for my modeling because they tell me what the aspirations of the member states are, and in particular, how much wind and solar PV there will be in the period from 25 to 30. Looking further ahead than that is ambitious. The tragedy of the commons that I want to explain, the old idea is that common resources which are owned by none and shared by all suffer from overexploitation unless some method is devised to address that problem. Now, in especially the island of Ireland, which I'm familiar with, when wind reaches a certain penetration and the wind is strong, then there's more wind produced than can be absorbed by the system, and that can drive the prices down to zero. And of course, all of the wind in principle, if it were in a competitive market, would face that very low price. But the point is that I'm going to make is that the last wind turbine on the system has a disproportionately large impact on the amount of curtailment, 3 to 4 times the average amount. But of course, everybody gets the average, not the marginal curtailment. And that's the tragedy of the commons. And that's the sense in which wind may overexploit the resource of being able to sell into a market with reasonable prices. So that's the outline. And what I'm going to do is to look particularly at the island of Ireland. It's an isolated system. It's probably at the cutting edge of wind penetration for a system of that size. And so it's having to face these problems before anybody else. And I'm going to build a model of the single electricity market. I should mention that Ireland as an island is unique amongst countries in Europe in that it's 2 jurisdictions sharing a singly regulated market, the single electricity market. Of course, now that Britain is no longer part of the EU, there are additional complications, but they need not detain us. So first of all, the beneficial and harmful externalities that are addressed by club goods. On the left, you will see the carbon price under the emissions trading system. That's the blue line, and it's given in British units because we were so unsatisfied with the low level of the carbon price at the end of 2009 to 10 that the government passed a law introducing a carbon price floor. And you can see the orange line that goes up this, which was intended to take the carbon price by about 2030 up to a reasonably high level at which such technologies as nuclear power in particular would be commercially viable without any additional subsidy. And the way it was implemented was through a carbon price support or tax that added to the emissions trading price. And you can see it raises the price that British generators faced up to that red line that slowly climbs. And interestingly, eventually the emissions trading system was reformed, and now the price is at what I would argue is a reasonably acceptable level. I'll come back to that. So one of these externalities has been addressed by carbon pricing. The other external positive benefit is that we see this most dramatically with solar PV. As you roll out increasing demands and install increasing quantities, so the technology improves, the scale effects are produced, research and development develops better technologies, and the costs fall. And it's a dramatic effect, so that every time you double the cumulative shipment, the cost falls by about 20%. And that's been going on now for 4 decades. So there is a benefit to subsequent users of the solar PV, and wind is similar but not so dramatic, in that when you install something, you create the demand that helps future installers obtain lower cost installations. And the critical point about this is the benefit comes from creating the demand and creating the installation, not from operating the plant. And we'll come back to that later. As I've said, we have clubs in the sense that the European Union has the emissions trading price. And as I've pointed out, it's been reformed to the point that the price is now within the Paris target consistent range that the World Bank Stiglitz report suggested. The other club aspect is setting renewables targets effectively provides an implicit subsidy for these learning externalities by requiring each country effectively to provide the subsidies to meet the targets they've been given. And these benefits I've calculated for onshore wind in about 2025 should be worth something like 10% of the capital cost. The club has been expanded. Mission Innovation is a group now of 24 countries that have collectively agreed to increase their financial support, particularly for solar PV. So that's a way of trying to spread this beyond the EU to a global consortium, a global club. Now, the clean energy package, as I've said, it requires countries to have their national energy and climate plans. And when we look at the single electricity market in Ireland, the target is 55% wind penetration by 2026. And that's almost entirely onshore. There isn't much PV. The links to the continent, well, at the moment, Ireland is linked electrically to Britain with 2 interconnectors. They would like to connect to France, but that won't happen before 2026. I'll come back to the impact that interconnectors potentially have on wind penetration and use later. As I said, all these countries have to produce their national plans, and that means I know what the planned wind, solar and nuclear power plants will be in countries that are directly or indirectly connected to Ireland. And I can forecast when the surplus of these inflexible zero variable cost plants will be such that there is a zero price. And in such cases, of course, there's no benefit from exporting, even if you could. And that turns out to have quite a significant effect on the value of trying to spread your wind abroad through interconnection. Now, on the face of it, you might think, well, wind doesn't blow all at the same time at the same place at different places. And if you look at the SEM and Britain, the correlation between output in the Ireland and in GB looks pretty small. And that would suggest interconnections offer a considerable advantage in dealing with surplus wind. However, if you look at the lagged amount of wind, the wind blows mainly from the west, from Ireland towards Britain. It seems to arrive about 4 hours later. And the correlation between wind in Ireland and wind subsequently in Britain 4 hours later is very strong. And that means that to analyze what your opportunities for exporting surplus wind are, you need a temporal model, a time sequence model. And of course, you also need that for any storage if you want to deal with surplus wind that way. And this just gives you a sense of what the problem is going to be. And this is looking just at 2017. It will be very substantially worse by 2025. And all of these countries have a considerable period of the time when the amount of wind is well above the average amount of wind that's produced. And you can see that the total is actually quite strongly correlated with that in Britain. So there isn't much additional benefit in exporting beyond Britain. Now, in order to model what amount of wind you can actually absorb in a system, you need to know what constraints on operating the system exist. And in a small isolated system like Ireland, stability is a major concern, and they require 5 specific units in different parts of the country to be running or available to increase their output to maintain stability. And that amounts to nearly 800 megawatts in a 4,000 megawatt average demand system. They also have to deal with the risk that the largest link or the largest generator will suddenly fail, and that requires a reserve equal to the size of the largest single element. And in practice, that's satisfied by the 5 units that have to be running. So we can just worry about the 795 megawatts. The critical constraint that we have to worry about is the amount of non-synchronous penetration on the system. Now, ordinary conventional generators, steam turbines, are spinning and they create inertia, so that if suddenly there is an increase in demand or a reduction in supply, that inertia, that spinning, can continue to supply power and prevent the system collapsing. But wind and solar PV and also interconnectors, which are DC interconnectors in the case of Ireland, are not synchronous. They don't have any spinning mass. They can't provide that inertia. And just jumping ahead, we can see, and recently the IAE had a very interesting presentation from Janusz Bialek showing the sorts of things that happen when suddenly you lose, in this case, 2 generation stations. The frequency drops. And if it drops too far or too fast, then it also trips other generators off the system, and the problem cascades and can become a complete system-wide blackout. That didn't happen in Britain because they managed to shed load. But having inertia on the system reduces the rate at which the frequency falls, and therefore gives you more time to respond to the emergency. So in order to have enough of that spinning mass on the system, the non-synchronous penetration, which in our case is mainly wind, has to be less than 75% of the amount that's being met the generation. There are various things you can do to make this more straightforward. 75% is very challenging. One of the things they do is to limit the rate of change of frequency, or they reset the limit so that the generation doesn't trip off the system. And in Ireland, they're moving to 1 hertz per second, a rate of change of frequency, which is 4 times as high as Britain. So they're trying to make a more resilient system to accommodate more wind. So I'm going to look at 2 scenarios. One is the as yet unreached target of 75%, that's the immediate ambition, and the more ambitious target of 85%, which may or may not be reached by the middle of this decade. I've already pointed out that you can't export your surplus wind and keep under that limit. If your neighbours are saturated, you might want to store it, and I'm modelling that as well. So here is what is happening. The green bars show the amount of gas generation, which is most of the generation of fossil plant in Ireland. There's hardly any coal left now. And you can see that the wind rises and the amount of gas generation is reduced. And as the wind rises, the system non-synchronous penetration, in this case, reaches very high levels. So it reaches almost the current limit. Now, when I want to model the market, I want to look forward to 2026. That's a convenient moment for which I have forecast penetrations, and it's about the time that the next interconnector may or may not be connected, depending how quickly it goes ahead. But in order to work out how much wind I have, I look at the hourly demand for the island in 2018, which was an average wind year, and I scale that up by the forecast demand to produce the 2026 amount of demand, 45 terawatt hours. I take 55% of that, and then I assume that we're looking at an average wind, and so I multiply the 2018 wind by 2.18 to forecast for each hour of the year in my model to 2026 what the demand is and what the amount of wind on the system will be. Now, the model is fairly straightforward. I have my for every hour of the year, I know how much is being produced for wind, how much demand there is, and how much export capacity I have. And the first thing I ask is, are my neighbours in surplus? If so, I can't export. If they can absorb wind, I export. If not, and this is in the high ambitious scenario, I look to see whether I'm breaching 85% of my wind penetration. And if I am, then I put some into storage. And if I can't export and I can't store it, then I have to spill it, and that's going to be the curtailment that I'm interested in. And I can produce a curve, if you like, a duration curve, which ranks the curtailed megawatt hours in descending order. I'll show you a graph in a minute. And the total amount is the curtailment. And then in order to find out what happens when extra wind comes on the system, I increase the capacity by 100 megawatts. and I re-estimate the curtailment, and that gives me the marginal curtailment per megawatt hour of extra wind. And that's what I'm really interested in. That's where the market failure, the problem of the liberalized market potentially will happen. And what I find for the model I've constructed, it will obviously depend on the system characteristics, is it's 3 to 4 times the average. And that's where the problem really becomes quantitatively significant. And these are some examples of these duration curves for curtailment. And it's the percentage of the year that you're curtailing 500 or 1,000 megawatts of wind. And the area under these curves will then be the amount, the total megawatt hours that's curtailed. And you can see that if we look at the wind less demand, this seems to be the amount that we're having to worry about, the surplus that's potentially available. If I export it, I can shift down to here. And if I put something into storage, that, since I don't have a lot of storage, improves things slightly. But the point is, these are not coincident, so that I've ranked each of them separately according to decreasing amounts. So when I come to actually looking at how much is curtailed, it depends very much on how much of the penetration I'm allowed to have is. So if I could increase penetration to 85%, I would curtail much less. But at 75%, I'm curtailing more than it might seem from these graphs here. So again, that arises from the non-coincident demand and wind. Now, when I looked at this, I realized that these curtailment curves are roughly linear. And more to the point, when I vary the wind capacity by, in this case, 1,000 megawatts to make it more dramatically visible, the curves seem to move essentially in parallel. And that means the huge advantage from an algebraic model is if I have a linear demand or a linear curtailment curve, I have something that I can work with algebraically. And I need to do that if I'm going to quantify to see if this is a big problem or not. So I can simulate or I can model, and this is what happens for the amount of gigawatt hours, which doesn't necessarily mean much, but this does. This is the percentage of the wind that's potentially available that is having to be curtailed when you have to limit the wind to 75% of demand. And as you increase this up to 85%, so the amount of curtailment falls, and the improvement is just the decrease in curtailment is shown down here. So the first message that comes over very strongly is it's really important to improve the resilience of the system so that it can withstand higher penetrations of wind. But even so, more wind dramatically increases curtailment. Now, I threatened you with a model. As I say, the details are given in the paper. I won't spend a great deal of time on the details, but I want to set out the methodology. And that is, I start off by saying, how much capacity do I need of flexible capacity that's reliably available to meet the standard, in the case of Ireland, of no more than, on average, 8 hours loss of load a year. So there are periods of the year when there's no wind and there's no sun, and in those days you need a reliable backup generation. So that will depend on the amount of demand on the system, and it will provide the necessary backup, but it has a cost. So if you add wind, I want to know how much does this cost go down? And that's the saving. And then how much does it cost to provide the extra wind? It has a capital cost, it has a running cost, which is quite low. And the running cost only runs in the hours when it's not curtailed. So this is going to be the social value of having wind. It's the saving in fossil costs less the extra cost of having the wind. And that's the social value of wind, but the market revenue is whatever the market prices will be, and I'm going to assume a competitive market in which the price is always equal to the marginal cost of the most expensive generation, or is given by scarcity prices. And when I do that, I see that there is a difference between these two expressions. And one way to think about it is, what would have to be the corrective charge to deal with the difference between the social value and the market value? And the market value in this case is higher than the social value because, as I said, the extra wind has a disproportionate effect on prices. So where are the various sources of market failure? The one problem which again came up, I think, in the earlier discussions of the Texas blackout is that the contribution that wind can make to system peak demands, and typically in Ireland, these are cold early evening hours in the winter, you have to derate them to find out how much they can contribute reliably. But the problem about wind is that unlike individual generating sets, it's best treated as one very large generating set, because when the wind stops blowing, it stops blowing for all of them at the same time. So actually setting the derating factor is quite tricky. And the problem in a liberalized market is that the market rewards the average, not the worst case scarcity. The system operator has to worry about the worst case, but the market just pays for the average case. And to come back to the new market failure that I'm testing out on you, the tragedy of the commons is that the competitive market prices are set not by the marginal value, but the average curtailment. And this, in gory details, gives the various corrective charges. There's this excess capacity credit, but the derating factor here, we could choose to set this equal to 0 when it comes to how much do you compensate renewables for its contribution to scarcity. Then there's a small factor which is essentially one that we can ignore, and then there's the marginal curtailment effect. And when I calibrate it, first of all, I should add in the learning externality, which in 2026, my central estimate is 10%. Again, the paper gives you details of how to calculate that. I've already argued for making the first capacity element 0, and that leaves the curtailment cost. And I look at two cases. One of them is the near-term penetration of 75%, but not having an interconnector to France. And that cost is 20%. But if I look ambitiously of raising this SNSP, and I add in a Celtic link, and I treble the amount of storage, perhaps by accessing more electric vehicles, then the cost comes down to 10%. And you can see that's very close to the learning benefit. So you could say that in an ambitious scenario, although each of these separately is materially important, they offset each other, so perhaps we can ignore them. And the policy options that are implied is, well, if we do want to go down the liberalized market route and leave everything to the market, then we have to recognize these two externalities, and there's a learning externality and this also this marginal curtailment effect, and they would offset each other. So we could just ignore them, or the simplest thing is, given that you have a target, you could auction the capacity subsidy for bringing in the amount of wind that you need. And in which case it's very important that it's a subsidy to the capacity, not to operating. But that's another story and I'll not dwell on it here. So the implications, I think, first of all, are this is a potentially material externality. the curtailment effect. It's much more serious on an isolated system. The continent doesn't have to worry about it because they have so much inertia. But small systems, and one can think of plenty of examples, will have to face this. But it may be that rather than just leaving it to the market, the simplest thing is to run auctions for capacity, and that can internalize it directly. So I'll reach my conclusions and then we can move over to the question and answers. So again, in small systems, high penetration leads to curtailment. At the moment, it's in the range forecast to be 8 to 13%, but at the margin, it's 4 times as high, and 4 times 13, we're getting into large numbers. Having interconnection helps. Raising the system non-synchronous penetration more is more important. And the system non-synchronous penetration, just to give you a simple idea of it, it's the fraction of demand that is met by wind. Non-synchronous is broader than wind, but I'm talking mainly about wind. Storage helps, but much less so. Derating wind, again, understates the average wind because it's dealing with worst case scenarios. So again, it tends to over-reward wind if you pay the value of lost load in scarcity situations. And the marginal curtailment is what drives the social value, but the market revenue is driven by the average curtailment. And again, they roughly offset. Maybe one can ignore them in some systems, but a simplest solution is just to auction the wind. So I will stop here and then we can move over to the questions, and I hope I'll be able to answer some of them. So perhaps I'll pick up the questions and go straight ahead. The first question I hope I've dealt with from Amulaha, and that was, how do I define system non-synchronous penetration? It's the elements on the system that are not spinning, so they're not synchronized, so they can't provide inertia as a percentage of the total demand on the system. And you can export the wind so that the amount that's left in the system is smaller and keeps you under the limit if you're lucky. The second question comes from Gorsan Gulen. Thanks for the insights. I'm not clear why there is less curtailment with a higher SNSP, especially as there is no ability to export or store. Well, the answer is how much wind you can absorb depends on how much is allowed by the SNSP, the system non-synchronous penetration. So if I'm allowed to have 85% wind on my system, I don't have to curtail as much as if I only have to have 75%. So it's a fairly simple arithmetical calculation. If you can't have as much wind, you have to curtail more. Tim Brennan has asked, just to clarify the intuition, is the idea that if I build a wind plant, it increases the probability that your wind plant will be curtailed, and I don't take that cost to you into account when I enter? That is exactly what I mean. So that is the tragedy of the common. My cow eating your grass means there's less grass for your cow to eat. And in this case, my wind power, my wind plant reduces the number of hours of the year that you can get handsomely paid by the price set by the fossil plant or by imports. I've answered all of the immediate questions. I don't know if anybody else wants to raise a question or whether I should pass back to Dave Williams.
Wow. Thank you, David, very much for a wonderful webinar and your expertise, obviously, in this industry, long standing. We wish to thank all of our listeners, and that this will be available on our rewind this afternoon. If you have any additional builds that you would like to make to this presentation, feel free to reach out to us or to David direct for questions. We're also very interested to host you on our webinar platform as well. If you have an interest, please reach out to IAEE at iaee.org. I thank you once again for listening and officially close this webinar.
Oh, well, I should just say another question has come
Very
in
sorry,
from
please.
Charles Mason.
Yes.
What extent is your result special to Ireland and how extendable is this? Well, I said at the beginning that Ireland is very much at the forefront of having to manage increased wind on a small and rather isolated system. So the answer is, I can think of places like Hawaii that might have similar problems. Any system which is not strongly connected by ordinary AC interconnectors with a larger system may have this problem. So if you're sitting in Germany, you're very lucky because you're surrounded by a large number of countries which are all synchronized with you. So if, as is often the case, there's too much wind in the north of Germany, you can send it to Poland or France or Belgium. And I've sat in the system operations in Laufenburg in Switzerland and seen the flows going around the rest of Germany of the surplus wind and sometimes even spilling into the Balkans, all because the whole system is synchronized and it's providing that inertia. But if I look at Great Britain, it's an isolated system, electrically isolated, it's not synchronized to the continent, and National Grid is already worried about inertia and has already had to deal with a potential blackout that Janusz Bialik talked about, and they are moving heaven and earth to get more flexible response on the system, to get fast frequency response. They will probably have to increase their rate of change of frequency limits, which is a non-trivial change to the settings on all of the generators on the system. But it's something that's coming. If you want to have above 55% renewables on your system, then you really have to worry about inertia and the consequences of my additional market failure, that the marginal impacts are potentially much larger than the average impacts.
David, any other last minute questions? There's a thank you. Felix comes in with one. Let's see. Is there a general issue about curtailment only? Isn't it also about wholesale price reductions, merit order effect in general? Thanks for clarifying.
Well, the merit order effect, you're perfectly correct, and there's plenty of evidence that increased wind drives down prices. Part of that is the bad system of support, so that if you only get your support when you generate, you may be willing to generate when the prices are negative, and you may be willing to drive the prices negative to get those subsidies. So some of it is bad support design, but quite clearly, if wind is at the margin, it's going to be setting a very low price in a liberalized market. Now, the counterbalance to that is you do need to have the spinning mass on the system. And if you don't have nuclear power and you don't have carbon capture and storage, this is going to be fossil generation. And it's going to run a rather small number of hours a year, but it's going to have to be there to provide the system stability. And it's going to have to be paid. So in order to persuade that to come into the system and to be there and to cover its costs, the average price in the system has some lower limit. You're still going to have a high enough average revenue to keep the fossil plant on the system. In the process where you have a disequilibrium quantity and too much fossil plant competing, the prices may be down lower. But in a long run equilibrium, the prices have to stabilize at a level to make the spinning reserve still commercially viable. So the answer is up to a point.
There may be another one or two more questions in there, David. I'm not certain.
I'm looking at the Q&A. I don't know if there's anything on the chat in addition.
just in the Q&A.
Right, the last one I have comes from, oh, wait a minute, let me scroll down a bit. Felix Muskins. Yes, so we've had the merit order effect. I think I've done that. And then we have another one. Are these curtailments done using AI IoT devices? That's a techie question. I think the question is, how do you tell a wind turbine to turn off? And I think the short answer is that if it's grid connected, it has to be in communication with the system operator, and he pulls a switch somewhere. If it's on the distribution network or if it's in your back garden, I'm not quite so sure about that. Who decides and what are the penalties if plants don't shut their plants? Well, as I say, if the system operator has a lever in his room and he pulls it and nothing happens, then he's probably going to claim you're in breach of the grid rules, and goodness knows what then happens. But managing, I think there's a genuine problem here when it comes to solar PV on domestic house roofs. And to some extent it's dealt with in that they trip off when the frequency drops enough. So again, in order to legally connect to the electricity grid, you have to have certain standards, and those standards are designed to protect the system. And I think those are the way it would be dealt with.
Very good. I think that that completes the Q&A. David, any last closing remarks?
Only to say we have a website where the paper is, the EPRG website at Cambridge, and my email is there, so feel free to contact me, and by all means download the paper and try and find what's wrong with it and let me know.
As well, IAEE will be posting your PowerPoint on our website this afternoon when we go live with the rewind of this video. Thank you once again, David, for participating. Always a pleasure to see you and have us on our platform. And for our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Wish you a good rest of your day, wherever this finds you on our fine globe. And I officially close this webinar.